The year is 1963, and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. is sitting in a jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama. In order to understand why, we need to go back a few years. The civil rights movement began in 1954 as the black community began to fight for equal rights. Staging largely peaceful protests around the country, tensions began to rise as the push to keep segregation stayed in place. Martin Luther King Jr. was a key figure in the civil rights movement. A black pastor from the South, he advocated for peaceful protests across the country, organizing bus boycotts, sit-ins, and marches. Peaceful actions were not used against King. His house was bombed, he was stabbed, and he received dozens of threatening letters. And yet, he still continued to advocate for peaceful protesting. After organizing a march in Birmingham, Alabama, King and his fellow protesters were met with police dogs and high-pressure water jets. Almost 1,200 people, including King, were arrested. Armed with only a pen and the margins of a newspaper to write on, King wrote one of the most influential letters of the civil rights movement. In order to understand why his letter is so impactful, we need to analyze his use of logos, ethos, and pathos. Let's begin with ethos. What is it, and why is it so important? Well, ethos establishes a writer's credibility, why the audience can trust the speaker and know that what they're saying is a good source of information. In order to understand how King uses ethos, you need to understand who he is writing to. He's not writing to the president. He's not writing to the common man, to his next-door neighbor. He is writing to white Southern pastors. This is important for several reasons. Not only does he use ethos to establish his credibility, he also uses it to relate to his audience. We see this in the beginning when he says, "I have the honor of serving as the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Organization." Now, this is important because it shows that he not only has an education, but that he's an influential figure in the Christian community around him, and it shows his faith, which allows him to relate to his audience instead of alienating them. It shows that while they might be different, they share the same fundamental beliefs. He continues on and says, "As the prophets of 8th century BC, as the Apostle Paul." Now, his audience is going to have a very good understanding of who the prophets and Paul are, as well as what they stood for. By relating himself to them, King is showing that he not only has an education, but he is similar to these people that his audience have read about. He's saying, hey, I'm the same as these people, but you vilify me and you lift and praise them. It allows him to connect on an educational level and a religious one, while also calling out the hypocrisy of his audience. He continues on, "I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all," and also says, Paul Tillich says that sin is separation. As white pastors were using the Bible in order to justify segregation, here King is using biblical examples and famous religious figures from history in order to justify his argument. It's amazing how he's able to bring from both sides, and while not alienating his audience, is able to connect and show them something they're already going to know. He's able to show his credibility using his knowledge and knowing who his audience is and relating himself to them and showing that he too is similarly educated. The second rhetorical device that King uses is pathos or pathos, which is appealing to the emotions of the audience, and it is often underutilized. While King uses it sparingly, the visual picture that he paints does justice enough. His words are very strong, very descriptive, like a literary gut punch. It's not something to be taken lightly. I'll let King speak for himself.
"But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will, and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters.
The way King uses pathos isn't gently. It might be sparingly, but there is nothing subtle about it. It is graphic. It is emotionally jarring. He doesn't use it to make the audience happy. They're supposed to feel extreme, raw emotion from what he's saying. He's showing that this isn't just affecting people. These aren't numbers. They aren't statistics. These laws are affecting families and they're affecting children. Let this next part sink in.
And your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky.
Now, at this time, most people are going to have a family of some kind, whether it be a wife and kids, or the various other people in their immediate family. So the way King is playing with the emotions of his audience, he's putting them in his shoes. He is letting them know that their actions impact other people. It's so deeply touching. This part makes me very emotional every time I read it. It's not supposed to be this, oh, segregation is bad because it hurts our feeling. He's able to show the impact that segregation and Jim Crow laws have on this community of people, of innocent people. And his use of pathos doesn't just stop there. He goes on to call them out, and once again, my words cannot do it justice.
I have looked at the South's beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward. I have beheld the impressive outlines of her massive religious education buildings. Over and over, I have found myself asking, what kind of people worship here? Who is our God?
King uses pathos sparingly, but it has such a deep impact every time he uses it, because he knows the power that it holds. And he continues after this, in deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church, but be assured that my tears have been tears of love. There can be no deep disappointment where there is not deep love. Everything he does is so descriptive that anyone who hears it can build the mental image of what's happening. He is showing them the reality of the situation, how disappointed and how angry he is, the hurt that his community is feeling, and yet he still assures them that there is love there. And every time I read this letter, this is where I get emotional, and this is where I begin to cry, because his words, his use of pathos is just so impactful. It's one of his strongest devices in the essay. Now, what King uses the most of is logos, or logic. He's attempting to appeal to the logic and reason of his audience. By saying, nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. He is bringing to light the reason behind the civil rights movement, the reason behind their sit-ins and boycotts, and how they are able to peacefully make a point in a way that disrupts society and calls attention to the issue. And the civil rights movement made sure to use nonviolent tactics, even though its opposing side was nothing but violent. He's able to show that they're able to peacefully make a point while the other side is unable to. And he continues, saying, lamentably, it is a historical fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. What wasn't made clear is that his audience is the privileged group. They're extremely privileged, usually highly educated, influential community figures. And he is showing their hypocrisy and not wanting this group to be up with them. They're all people. They all worship the same God, all born in the same country, and yet they're not willing to be the same. King continues saying, we have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. So not only is he bringing in the facts from the founding of America, that all men are created equal, he's also pulling in that biblical tie again with God-given rights, and is showing his audience the depth of just how much they're willing to ignore what is in the Bible. And he does say, if I have said anything in this letter that overstates the truth and indicates an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me, because he made a call out that was based around facts that couldn't be argued against. His point is extremely clear and shows the senselessness of the oppressor's arguments. And he continues on, and his use of logos just becomes more and more powerful. He talks about how he sees himself in between two opposing forces, one being a force of complacency from his community, but the other being one of bitterness and hatred from pro-segregation activists. He's showing that his complacency in his community is peaceful, but these counter-protesters are just bitter and mean and angry and hurtful. And you can't argue against that, because all of history of the civil rights movement was showing this, being met with police dogs and high-pressure water jets for a peaceful march in Birmingham, Alabama. And one of my favorite things about his use of logos is that it is very rarely just sprinkled in. There are paragraphs upon paragraphs that are nothing but facts. Towards the beginning, his use of logos is very liberal, with a fair use of ethos, but not much pathos. It creates a heavy-hitting argument that is difficult to refute. Towards the end, his anger turns towards the hypocrisy of his audience. He says, I've been so greatly disappointed with the white church and its leadership. I felt we would be supported by the white church, felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. These sentences are so powerful, and King has packed so much emotion into his words while retaining the fact. He is revealing the true nature of his audience and opposition. He continues on saying, perhaps I have once again been too optimistic. Is organized religion too intrinsically bound to the status quo to save our nation and the world? He is using his logos as he used his ethos as a way to relate to his audience while also showing their true nature to them, showing them a mirror of their sins and their hypocrisy that they're unwilling to confront. And as his letter goes on, he just gets more and more passionate, and yet still retains the validity of his argument. Instead of belittling and mocking his opposition, he's maintained his firm and educated stance. And to me, his use of logos is what makes this letter so amazing.